Good afternoon. My name is Anthony, and I'll be your conference operator today. At this time, I would like to welcome everyone to the Connect and Explore webinar. All lines have been placed on mute to prevent any background noise. If you should need assistance during the call, please press star, then the number 0, and an operator will come back online to assist you. Thank you. Mr. David Bergen, you may begin your conference.
Thanks very much. Greetings and welcome everyone to the National Collaborative on Childhood Obesity's Research's Connect and Explore webinar. My name is David Berrigan. I'm a program director at the National Cancer Institute and a longtime NCCOR member. I'm delighted to host today's webinar, which is spotlighting the brand new Measures Registry Learning Modules, helping you understand measurement concepts and approaches for diet and physical activity research. Today's program has 3 parts. First, we're going to give an overview of NCCOR tools related to measurement and these new modules. Second, we'll have one-on-one time with the subject matter experts who authored these modules. And finally, we'll close with some NCCOR announcements. If you have a question for our speakers during the webinar, please do not hesitate to write it in the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. If you need technical assistance, please let us know using the same chat box. If you are having trouble logging into the webinar but can hear us on the phone, please email us at ncor@fhi360.org and you can receive technical assistance. A final important note is if you are listening to the webinar using your computer speakers, please mute your microphones. This will reduce the potential for echo and background noise. We will live tweet during the webinar, so if you're on Twitter or other social media platforms, we encourage you to join the conversation by using the hashtag @ConnectExplore and following @NCCOR on Twitter and @NCCOR.org on Facebook. So we're very grateful to have authors of the Measures Registry Learning Modules on our webinar today to answer your questions after I finish this overview. Jordan Carlson from the Center for Children's Healthy Lifestyles and Nutrition at Children's Mercy in Kansas City. Leslie Lytle, Professor and Chair of Health Behavior from UNC Chapel Hill. Sharon Kirkpatrick from the School of Public Health and Health Systems, the University of Waterloo, and Dr. Greg Welk, Professor of Kinesiology and Director of the ISU Translational Research Network at Iowa State University. It's thanks to their expertise and incredible diligence over the last over a year that made these modules the terrific resource that they are. We're going to have an interactive poll to start things off, and you can submit your answers directly on the screen, and this will help give me the flavor of what kind of people are listening. Well, so we've got about 40 or 50% of the attendees already have responded. So for a federal health survey, that's an excellent response rate. And I'm delighted to see that there's not just researchers on the line, but educators, practitioners, and students as well. So hopefully there'll be material in this presentation and opportunities for questions that apply to the full spectrum of people that NCCOR is definitely trying to reach out to. So I'll start off with the body of this spotlight. This will be an overview of NCCOR measures-related resources and these new learning modules before we dive into the questions for the subject matter experts. NCCOR, as many of you know, was formed in 2009, and it's a research collaborative of the 4 leading funders of childhood obesity research: CDC, NIH, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and USDA. Some of the recent work we've been doing on measures is also funded by the JPB Foundation, a collaborator with NCCOR. NCCOR's mission is to accelerate progress in reducing childhood obesity, focusing our efforts on identifying, designing, and evaluating interventions, increasing and improving surveillance, improving capacity to conduct research and program evaluation, providing national leadership, and working with non-health partners to integrate childhood obesity priorities. As part of this the third priority that I mentioned, a key aspect of NCCOR's work has been promoting the use of common measures and methods across childhood obesity prevention research. Standard measures are really needed to improve research and evaluation, to evaluate interventions, to address programs and policies, and to progress towards identification and implementation of evidence-based approaches to the childhood obesity epidemic. So we have a suite of tools that we've been developing to try to promote this measurement. One of these tools is the Measures Registry, launched in 2011. The registry is a web-based portfolio of nearly 1,400 validation studies on more than 100 discrete measures addressing individual diet, the food environment, individual physical activity, and the physical activity environment. So this searchable registry includes abstracted information from each paper about the measure type, number of items, study design, validity, and reliability, and allows people to search through the different validation studies and get the flavor of measures that are available. So it's an invaluable complement to something like PubMed, where it can be hard to separate out actual validation studies from the myriad of extant research papers. You can visit the Measures Registry at ncor.org/measures, and you can also find at the website past webinars describing the registry and how to use it. Even though the registry is a valuable resource for identifying validation studies, we realized that it can be challenging for users who aren't necessarily black belts in measurement to choose the most appropriate measure. So in 2015, we commissioned a series of monograph-length registry user guides that are organized in the same 4 domains as the Measures Registry. They provide an overview of measurement, case studies, principles of measure selection, and myriad additional resources to help introduce people to the complex challenges of measurement in these domains. So we think the user guides are helping to move the field forward by improving knowledge and fostering more consistent approaches to measure selection. You can take a look at these guides at the NCCOR website, and again, as with the previous resource, you can see past webinars describing the user guides. So then, now to the heart of this webinar is the introduction of this brand new resource, the Measures Registry's Learning Modules, also organized into these 4 domains: individual level diet and physical activity, and then environmental influences on food and physical activity. So these learning modules, there's 17 modules, 4 for each domain and an introductory module. Each module is 15 minutes or less. They're designed to introduce the domain, highlight key topics, demonstrate the process of choosing a measure via case study, and include quizzes to test your knowledge. So the motivation for this was the user guides received a lot of clicks, citations, and have been a welcome resource, but during the course of a series of focus groups about what people needed, overwhelming feedback was received that people would like some short, pithy, concise introductions to give them sort of the flavor of the topic and help them figure out what they needed to delve into more deeply. So this led us to develop these videos that explained some of the key topics. in measurement. So the Measures Registry Learning Modules have a landing page, and you can access each of the 4 domains in the introductory module and listen to them at your leisure. The introductory module includes an overview of the NCCOR Measures Registry, the user guides, and the registry learning modules, trying to present this in a kind of seamless set of tools that can guide you from utter ignorance to sophisticated use of measures in the childhood obesity research domain. The four areas match the domains that NCCOR has categorized for childhood obesity research. The individual diet module series, authored by Sharon Kirkpatrick, addresses considerations related to the measurement of dietary behaviors in children, addressing an introduction, considerations for measuring diet, overview of measures of individual diet, and case studies. Similarly, the Food Environment Module series, authored by Leslie Lytle, addresses considerations related to measuring the physical, social, and person-centered environments that play a role in what people eat. Leslie emphasizes the needs for measuring the physical, social, and person-centered aspects of the food environment, and focusing on how do you make a decision about which aspects of the environment to measure. The individual physical activity module, authored by Greg Welk, addresses considerations that influence decisions about physical activity assessments and really summarizes an enormous literature, and I can say that because I'm more familiar with this research area myself, in a very sophisticated and lucid way. The series covers why it's important to distinguish between measurement and assessment, calculating energy costs of physical activities for adults and youth, and selection of activity monitors and how to use them. So I commend this module to you because of my own special interest in this area. Lastly, Lastly, the Physical Activity Environment module, authored by Jordan Carlson, addresses the built environment and the use of geospatial tools, as well as auditing, to assess environmental influences on physical activity. Again, a fascinating set of modules describing a growing and complex area of measurement. Each domain includes the opportunity to explore more resources specific to the module, a glossary of terms, links to other helpful resources, and a suggested citation. So we see these learning module guides and the registry as part of an evolving package of resources to help move childhood obesity research forward towards better measurement and more consistent measurement across similar study designs. So with those remarks by way of introduction, we're going to move towards a question and answer period with the subject matter experts. And we've compiled some questions that were emailed to us in advance of the webinar, as well as we're keen to answer questions that listeners type into the questions or chat box that you can see on your webinar screen. We'll begin by inviting the authors to address some of the pre-mailed questions, and then we'll ask the authors to respond to questions in the chat boxes. If there are remaining questions, we'll respond in writing and include these in a follow-up email we'll be sending to all the participants in the study. So again, as a reminder, if you have questions, please type them into the chat box located to the right of the screen, and we'll start moving through these questions. The subject matter experts are the actual authors of the modules, so they have a deep knowledge of all 4 of these domain areas. So let's kick it off with a question for Sharon Kirkpatrick. What are the advantages of using the Measures Registry Learning Modules?
Thanks, David. As you've mentioned, there's so many measures available, and I liked your analogy to the black belt in measurement. It really can be somewhat daunting to determine which measure is the best for a given study. The Measures Registry really allows easy searches for measures that have been used in studies focused on different subpopulations of children and with varied purposes. And the Measures Registry also connects users with resources, not only the user guides that David mentioned, but also the original validation studies, so you can learn more about the measures. This can be a really great first step towards narrowing down which measure might be most appropriate. And I would add as well that although NCCOR is focused on childhood obesity, measuring dietary patterns and physical activity are relevant to many other domains of interest. For example, dietary patterns and environmental sustainability. So the Measures Registry really can be helpful to a range of researchers.
Thanks, Sharon. The next emailed question for Greg. Dr. Welk, I teach kinesiology courses related to measurement and evaluation of physical activity. Can you provide an example of how I can best incorporate the modules into my curriculum?
Yep, thanks, David. So I actually can resonate with this question because I also teach similar courses and have used the modules for this very purpose, or the user guides. So one key point is that the user guides were designed kind of for graduate student exposure. So for that level, a person that doesn't really have a lot of background but maybe has interest in that area. And the video modules in particular provide a more engaging way to kind of access the material and, you know, an introduction to the topic. But you'll see that we point people to dig deeper into the user guides and the Measures Registry itself to, you know, really fully understand things. So I guess to answer the question, I'd recommend like having students or viewers watch the modules and answer the questions, because that helps them know what they know and what they don't know. And the case study actually at the end is one of the 4 case studies that are in the actual user guide. So an assignment could be to go into the user guide and then, you know, answer questions more specifically about the other case studies, or to create a different case study and have students apply the method. So we train students through the modules to use this acronym to help them make good decisions about assessments, and that could be applied in a novel context to see if they can apply the information.
Terrific. Thank you.
Yeah.
So let me remind you, you've got a high-powered subject matter expert team here for questions not just about the modules, but, you know, measurement challenges in childhood obesity research generally, which can be informed by their knowledge of NCCOR resources. So looking forward to some questions from the audience. In the meantime, for Dr. Lytle, as a public health practitioner, I am working on a project with our local parks and recreation department to improve their food environment. How can I use the learning modules to guide me towards which food environment measures we should include in our project?
Thanks, David. I think this is a really great question, and it's a very, very large question. I think the first thing that's really important, particularly when you're talking about the food environment, would be for the team to really understand what aspect of the food environment that they're interested in, because I think everybody looks at this topic from a little different angle. So, for example, in the learning modules and in the user guide, I talk about the physical environment, the social environment, and the person-centered environment. So the physical environment might be things like what foods are available at park and rec centers, what's in the vending machine, what's offered for snacks. So is the team interested in the physical environment, or are they interested in the social environment, which might be things that relate to policies around our staff allowed to drink soft drinks in front of the kids at the rec center, or are there policies about using food as reinforcements? And then the third area, this person-centered, is, you know, our research on the food environment shows repeatedly that people's perceptions of the food environment is actually often more impactful about their food choices than the actual physical and social environment. So in answering this question, I'd say first the team needs to get some clarity about what aspects of the food environment they are most interested in, and they can be interested in more than one, but the clarity about what that is important. And then within our within the users guides, we have a whole set of instruments that say if you're measuring the physical environment, these are the types of tools. If you're measuring the social environment, these are the types of tools. So the team would get some information from the user guide. And then in our learning modules, we actually have, I have a whole module in there about a community level team that's going through the process of making this decision. And, you know, we call on looking at not only the consideration of what you're really trying to impact, but how to understand feasibility and logistic concerns and how to choose the most valid and reliable. So it's a really big question, but I think we've got lots of good resources for community groups to look at to help them make better decisions.
Terrific. You know, I'd like to ask a follow-up to that response. Actually, you mentioned sort of perceptions of the environment and you know, measured characteristics of the environment. And I know in the physical activity environment area, there's an emerging literature suggesting that both of those things matter. So I wonder if you could talk a little about, you know, the interaction between objective characteristics of the environment and perceptions. And after you respond to that, I'd like to call on Jordan to see if he has any comments about how do you decide when you need to, you know, measure characteristics of the environment or characteristics of people's responses to the environments, or if we need to move towards doing both those things.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question because, again, you know, what we've learned in the research is that we can actually go into a store or a neighborhood and objectively identify that, yes, there are healthy food options here. But if the community members don't perceive that there are healthy food options in those stores, then they're not likely to go into those stores to look for foods. So, you know, if you're designing an intervention, I think the piece is that, first of all, the physical environment has got to provide the availability and accessibility of the foods we want people to eat. So, you know, in this last example of the community rec group, if there aren't healthy foods available in the rec center, guess what? People aren't going to be able to make healthy foods. But as an interventionist, not only do you want to change those foods, but you also want to do some kind of intervention that increases people's awareness that those foods are now available. And I would even say influencing the social environment is as important to make sure that kids see, for example, that other kids in the community group are eating those foods and enjoying those foods, or that staff like healthy foods. So I think it's difficult to pick out one specific environment, but again, people have to balance resource needs and feasibilities to make the best choices about what they actually assess.
Thanks. Jordan, do you want to comment on this challenge of measured characteristics of the physical activity environment versus perceptions?
Yeah, my thoughts are similar. They're both important. If you want to evaluate environmental projects or environmental changes, you might use an objective measure. But again, if the residents in those areas aren't aware of or still have perceived environmental barriers, say to physical activity, then you would want to better understand the perceptions of those residents as well.
Super. And Jordan, since now that your voice is warmed up, an emailed question for you. I would like to examine walkability in my local community do I have to know how to use ArcGIS software to use the environmental measures listed in the registry?
Oh yeah, great question. So a lot of folks are using audit tools, and that can involve either staff, like of a community organization, or researchers auditing the neighborhood, or sometimes can involve community residents auditing the neighborhood, kind of walking the streets, doing a systematic checklist of the environment in the area. Many people are also doing those audits via Google Street View, so they don't ever have to leave the comfort of their own office and walk outside, which is interesting, but can really be efficient if you need to do a lot of these audits. But then regarding GIS or kind of macro scale neighborhood environment measures, a couple of really neat things that we've been using lately without having to have ArcGIS or GIS expertise is WalkScore. So if you're not familiar with WalkScore, it's this kind of website that's primarily used in real estate, but it gives a walk score related to walkability for any address, and you can get those for any address or for block at the block group level, and you can kind of easily upload a whole list of addresses or block groups into WalkScore and generate walk scores for those areas. So we've done that in some of our work. And then the other thing that we've been using more recently is the U.S. Environmental Protections Agency did a national walkability index for the whole country, and it has really good coverage for most communities across the whole U.S. And this walkability index was derived, to match what's been used in a lot of the research literature. It's derived at the block group level, so you can obtain this walkability index information for any block groups in your community, and you can do all of that pretty much without having to use GIS software. So they're kind of things like residential density, walkability, land use mix, and variable and street connectivity, things like that have already been computed in this EPA walkability data set.
Tremendous. Yeah, I'd like to mention that the EPA Walkability Index is in the process of being updated, and the lead on that, John Thomas at the EPA, told me recently that they expect to have the update early in 2020. So there'll be an opportunity to use, the most recent data describing block group characteristics. The other thing I thought I might mention in relation to this question is ArcGIS is expensive and has a steep learning curve, but I think there's a growing body of open source and in some cases more user-friendly software for spatial analyses. So if ArcGIS doesn't appeal to you, don't despair. It's possible to explore some other kinds of tools that can contribute to spatial analyses.
And we often collaborate too with planning departments and geography departments, and finding GIS experts. It usually isn't too difficult and can be fun collaborations as well.
Absolutely. A couple of short questions, and then we have a few more questions coming in by email. How long are each of the learning modules? The modules are between 5 and 15 minutes long, with the majority taking less than 10 minutes to complete. So we believe these could be an excellent adjunct to a course you were teaching, or just a useful thing to dip into as you begin to think about a research or evaluation project going forward. Second, are there continuing education units available for completing the learning modules? No, there are no CEUs, but each module, except for the introductory module, has a series of 5 randomized quiz questions to test your knowledge. Again, an element of the modules that we introduced with the notion that people might want to use this for their teaching. And third, are the learning modules free to access? Yes, the modules are completely free to use, as are the user's guides, Measures Registry, and a variety of other resources on the NCCOR website. Another question for Greg, if Greg, you're still on the line. A participant asked, does the physical activity measures learning module address consumer devices like Fitbits, which are obviously getting very popular both amongst consumers and amongst researchers?
Right. That's very clearly what one of the modules is about. So yeah, we knew that there would be a lot of interest in that. So while researchers use, some, various research grade devices, we know that there's a lot of interest in consumer devices like Fitbit. So the examples cover those kind of issues, and we try to cover that complex area as carefully as we can, and caution some groups about jumping into that unless you really have expertise or know people that can provide that, because it's often tricky to get data off of these devices. They're very useful for helping to assess and promote at the individual level, but for research and evaluation purposes, it's pretty challenging. But yeah, one of the modules is specifically on that topic, and it refers back to the user guides as well.
Tremendous. And here's a question for Sharon, and one I'm very interested in. In physical activity research, we're starting to use a lot of 24-hour recalls as an approach to assessing physical activity, but they have pretty high respondent burden. You need to get people to give multiple 24-hour recalls. They take 20 minutes or more. And in dietary research, I know these 24-hour recalls are one of the most prominent tools. So how should we balance researcher and respondent burden with getting the best data possible especially in community-based studies where we're asking a lot of people, or both on the researcher side and the community side, in terms of dealing with these complex and burdensome data collection approaches?
Yeah, that's a tough question. Thanks, David. So, I would start with what you were just mentioning, complex, and dietary behaviors are very complex. So one of the first steps is to figure out exactly what it is about dietary behaviors that you hope to measure. As a researcher who works in dietary assessment, yes, we think that everybody should use multiple 24-hour recalls, but that's just not feasible for most studies. So narrowing down exactly what you're trying to measure and how you're going to be using those data. Do you only need to be able to rank people, for example, as high or low consumers, or know whether people consume fast food or not, versus trying to characterize precisely or accurately intake of added sugars, for example? Those have very different demands in terms of the data that we collect. Within the individual diet user guide, we do have a series of questions, and we adapted these from a paper by Sternfeld and Goldman-Rosas that was actually around physical activity and sedentary behavior. And that goes through a number of different considerations that you could work through in narrowing down which measures might be most appropriate. We do include, just like the prior authors, logistical constraints as the last consideration, because we want people to think about what's the best case scenario before they start ruling things out, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, Konstantina asks, and this question I think is good for Greg, do you address in the modules or perhaps in the user guides the validity of tools like Fitbit?
Yes, we point out resources where that information is available, but the literature keeps changing on that. And one point we like to try to make is that validity is a relative term, really. It depends on how precisely you need to estimate that value. So validity doesn't mean it's in a published paper or that it has a significant or non-significant p-value. It really means how precisely do you need to know. So validity is an evolving term, and it's in the eye of the beholder, really. So we refer to the Measures Registry to help people find articles and encourage them to go to the source or go to other experts. But that literature and the accuracy or the validity of these tools keeps evolving on a day-to-day basis. So I hope I didn't dodge around that question too much, but that's my answer.
It's definitely a challenge too in the Measures Registry, where you see validation studies for the newest devices, but also for devices that are no longer even manufactured. So that really reflects the dynamic characteristics of this technology space that is a difficulty.
Right. The other thing I will add, can I add one more point, David?
Yeah,
so the other
please.
point we often reference in the user guides in the modules is we advocate the use of a term called mean absolute percent error, and for researchers or program evaluators to look for that, because that helps you know a reasonable estimate of how closely your estimate will correspond to the value you're seeing. So if it's 20%, then you know it's within 20% of that value. And so a lot of papers would report, other statistics, but a descriptive value of mean absolute percent error gives you the best indicator of how precisely can you estimate that physical activity in that case.
Tremendous. I think we have one more question that perhaps Leslie can start with, but I'd be interested if the other three of you want to address it as well. And this is, often when we're addressing childhood obesity, we care about both diet, physical activity, and their environmental influences. So how can practitioners and researchers go about combining measures from all four domains? Are there structured approaches to combining all these, or is each person on their own in terms of thinking about the critical influences in their particular setting?
Yeah, this is another tough question, because you're absolutely right, David. If we're doing an intervention study to prevent obesity in, let's say, a school-age population, it is very likely that we are trying to impact both the food environment of the school as well as the physical activity environment of the school, and we're going to know we're successful by measuring the dietary intake of children in the school and their physical activity levels. So in even a simple example like a school-based intervention to reduce childhood obesity, you're immediately plugged into all four domains. So the advantage with the Measures Registry is that it provides practitioners and researchers at least with a set of tools in all of those domains that might be helpful. The tricky part is to choose the most important ones for the study, because none of us can measure everything we would like to measure in a research study. But it does require that we do this really transdisciplinary work that says, I need somebody who knows something about diet assessment, and I need somebody who knows something about physical activity assessment, and I might be a food environment expert, but I'm not the expert on the physical activity environment. So the other thing I like about these tools is it really does suggest how important a transdisciplinary approach to childhood obesity work is.
I want to chime in there and then open it up to the others. You mentioned transdisciplinary approach, but also at the community level, it might also be important to consider a trans-agency approach. So
exactly.
Departments of Health and Transportation could join, as well as researchers from the engineering school and the School of Public Health.
Exactly.
Yeah. Does anyone else want to chime in on that question?
Sure, this is Sharon. I would say, I'd echo what Leslie mentioned, and then again go back to being very clear about which constructs are most important to measure, and making sure that your environmental measures and your behavioral measures line up in that way. So as Leslie was mentioning, if you're trying to evaluate an intervention, you want to understand if the intervention changed that component of your environment, such as sugary beverages in vending machines, for example, and then also have a dietary measure of sugary beverage consumption, as well as other dietary components that might change if sugary consumption reduces. So kids might start consuming more juice or milk, for example. So linking those in a logical way before you start your data collection. The other thing I would add is it's really important to think ahead of your data collection how these data are going to be analyzed, because sometimes that does have a bearing in terms of if you are using 24-hour recalls, for example, how many do you need and at what intervals and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think to point back to both the user's guides and the learning modules, we include case studies in all of those. And I think they try to, those are really helpful in trying to get people to sort of think through the real practical questions that come up when you're doing research or doing a practice-based study.
Tremendous. So I think thanks everyone for those questions. And in the final part of our program, I'm going to turn it over to Amanda Scharfman of the Coordinating Center for some announcements and what have you. But I do think this conversation and the questions were really interesting. And to me, the take-home message is it's vital to be really intentional about what your question is and how you're going to address it, and really try to select the tools that will work for that question. So if we can all absorb that, I think that's valuable for people in all different areas of childhood obesity research and practice. Amanda?
Thanks, David. Make sure you sign up for our newsletter to be the first to know about upcoming events, including our upcoming webinars, to highlight how practitioners and students in particular can use the Measures Registry Learning Modules. You can sign up with the link on the right-hand side, and if you've used or plan to use Measures Registry Learning Modules, make sure you tell us how using our NCCOR email, and you could end up being one of the featured speakers on our next webinar. Again, our NCCOR email is ncor@fhi360.org. We will also be at APHA this year, November 3rd through 6th in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Our NCCOR booth is 1232, so please plan to stop by if you're attending to receive more information about the modules and learn more about other NCCOR resources. If you have any other questions about NCCOR or upcoming activities, please feel free to email us at the Coordinating Center at ncor@fhi360. And to access the webinar after it's been recorded and downloaded, please go to our website and click Webinars on the top navigation. All of the upcoming and archived webinars are displayed there, and you can access them for free at any time. So we just wanted to thank everyone again for attending the webinar. A special thanks to our Measures Registry Learning Module authors for joining us. Jordan, Sharon, Leslie, and Greg, thank you so much for answering everyone's questions. And David, thanks again for moderating this great discussion. Before you sign off, please take a minute to complete our brief survey. Your responses will help shape future webinars and maximize attendees' time. We'll switch over to the feedback form now, and you can write your input directly on the screen and hit submit.